In this video, we're going to talk about the quadratic formula and where it came from. So in order to find the quadratic formula, let's start with what I mean by a quadratic. A quadratic is an equation in this form. And it makes it quadratic because it's to the power of 2, by the way. That's what makes it quadratic. And we've talked about ways to solve this. We looked at factoring, we looked at the root property, and completing the square. But we know we can't always factor. We can always, though, complete the square. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to do the steps for completing the square on this general form for the quadratic. And that's going to produce the quadratic formula. So the steps for completing the square are, first thing we want to do is move the c term to the other side. And I like to put a little blank space there. Then we're going to divide everything by a if a isn't 1. Well, clearly a is not 1, it's a. So I'm going to divide everything by a. And what that's going to leave me with is x squared plus b over ax equals negative c over a. Now, I kind of put the x to the right because really we're only dividing the number in front of the x by a. So that's kind of why I wrote it like that. I want us to see what it is that we're exactly have in front of the x. Okay, so on the next part of completing the square, we need to half this middle term here. So this term right here, we're going to take half of it. And we've talked about this previously when we went through completing the square. The way you can take half of a fraction is multiply it by half. So that's going to be, when you multiply fractions, you go straight across. So that's b over 2a squared. And now squaring that is going to be, so I'll square the numerator, which is b squared, and then the denominator would be 4a squared. And that is what I'm going to add to both sides. 4a squared b squared over 4a squared. Okay, perfect. So now we know that on the left side, we're going to factor that, and we're going to factor to what it is. We'll use our trick right before we square it. That's what this is going to factor into. So this is going to factor into x plus b over 2a squared. And look back at the completing the square video if you don't remember that trick. Okay, but on the right side, I need to add those two fractions, and that's going to mean I need a common denominator. So I need to multiply this first fraction by a 4 and another a. So numerator, denominator, multiply by that. So it's going to be negative 4ac over 4a squared plus b squared over 4a squared. So combined together, just rewrite the left side. That's going to be negative 4ac plus b squared over 4a squared. Okay, and I'm going to take one more step before I start solving. And typically they don't like it when the very first number is negative like it is right here on the right. They don't like that. So what we'll do instead of leaving that as a negative, I'm going to go ahead and reorder it so it's b squared minus 4ac. It's just a little like nicer to look at when it's positive. Kind of one of those weird things that they like to do in math. Okay, so now the whole purpose of this is so that we can use the root property. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Oops, let me switch back. There we go. Okay, green pen. Square root of both sides. Now the left side, the squared goes away. That's the whole point of completing the square. On the right side, because we're doing a square root, I have to include a plus or minus. And since this is a fraction, I'm going to break up the square root over the numerator and the denominator. Now, don't panic. I know that looks kind of terrible, but we're actually not really interested in the numerator. We're really interested in the denominator. You might remember we don't like to leave radicals in the denominator. And I notice that everything in the denominator is in fact a perfect square. I can take the square root of 4 and I can take the square root of a squared. So I can simplify this denominator into, let me rewrite the numerator, 2a. Okay, that's actually kind of nice because The next step, I'm going to finish solving for x by subtracting this b over 2a to the other side. And normally I do that, I just kind of stick it out in the front. Plus or minus b squared 4ac. Okay. And because they already have a common denominator, I'm going to put it into one fraction. And we're actually done. We did it. This is the quadratic formula right here. It's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This is the quadratic formula. And in the next video, we'll use it to solve some problems.